The air conditioning on planet Zenthori was about as reliable as a politician's promise, which meant the Galactic Military Academy's main training hall felt like the inside of a fusion reactor. Perfect weather for breaking spirits, according to Drill Instructor Moran. Moran stood at the front of the amphitheater, all 6 arms crossed in what the recruits had learned was his signature pose of disappointment. His Thraken heritage blessed him with natural intimidation factors, scales that shifted color based on mood, currently a lovely shade of irritated purple, and mandibles that clicked when he was particularly annoyed with the universe. "Listen up, you collection of evolutionary mistakes," Moran barked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had personally witnessed 3 galactic wars and survived to complain about all of them. Today we are reviewing planetary military simulations. For those of you whose brain cells are still recovering from last night's recreational activities, let me explain what that means. The training hall buzzed with nervous energy. 43 recruits from 17 different species sat in neat rows, each one trying to look more prepared than they actually felt. The Zenthari Academy prided itself on producing the galaxy's finest military officers, which was like saying they produced the galaxy's finest headaches, just with better uniforms. "We have successfully conquered the Raxan Desert campaign," Moran continued, his middle set of arms gesturing toward the holographic display screens. "Casualty rate acceptable. We have mastered the Kelani Ice Moon siege, duration within parameters." His upper arms tapped impatiently against his chest. "We have even managed to complete the infamous Drakmor asteroid defense grid scenario. Though barely." Judge Quintara, whose Vorthak physiology made her look like someone had crossbred a praying mantis with a chandelier, raised one of her blade-like appendages. "Instructor Moran, what about the simulation that has never been completed?" "Oh, the sweet innocence of youth." Moran's scales shifted to a deeper purple, the kind that suggested someone was about to learn a valuable lesson about asking the wrong questions. "I was hoping someone would ask," Moran said, his mandibles clicking in what might have been amusement or homicidal intent. "Behold, the legendary Earth simulation." The holographic display flickered to life, showing a small blue-green planet that looked deceptively peaceful. Several recruits leaned forward with interest. Others, the smarter ones, leaned back with concern. "Earth," Moran announced with the enthusiasm of someone describing a particularly unpleasant medical procedure, "home to the humans. The simulation covers their planetary conflict period, roughly corresponding to what they call World War II. Simple enough premise: manage global military operations across multiple continents, while maintaining supply lines, diplomatic relationships, and troop morale." Morton, whose click heritage gave him the appearance of an oversized beetle with anger management issues, chittered excitedly. "That sounds manageable, Instructor." "Oh, does it?" Moran's scales now approached a shade of purple that suggested imminent violence. 847 attempts. 847 failures. Over 200 years of trying. Admiral Vashy lasted 3 minutes before declaring the scenario impossible. General Krafthnog spent 6 hours screaming at the holographic interface before demanding a transfer to the Outer Rim. Brandon Torres, one of the 2 humans in the class, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Being human at the Galactic Military Academy was like being a vegetarian at a barbecue competition. Technically allowed but generally misunderstood. "The problem," Moran continued, warming to his favorite subject of universal failure, "is that human military strategy makes no logical sense. They fight wars with their emotions instead of their brains. They make decisions based on concepts like honor and revenge rather than tactical advantage. They sacrifice strategic positions for symbolic victories. It is, in short, complete madness." "But surely," Judge Quintara pressed, "there must be some logic to their methods if they survived long enough to develop space travel." Moran's laugh sounded like gravel being processed through a meat grinder. "Logic? Human logic is like Thraken poetry, theoretically possible, but painful to experience. They built their entire military doctrine around concepts that would make a rational being weep." In the back corner of the hall, barely visible behind a Vorthak exchange student whose natural camouflage made him blend with the wall panels, sat Amy Kowalski. Unlike her fellow human Brandon, who felt compelled to defend their species at every opportunity, Amy preferred observation to participation. She took notes in a small tablet, occasionally glancing up when Moran's voice rose to particularly dramatic heights. The Earth simulation, Moran concluded, remains unbeaten because human warfare is fundamentally incompatible with logical thinking. No rational being can successfully replicate their methods, because no rational being would attempt such methods in the first place. The room fell silent except for the background hum of failing air conditioning and the occasional click of Moran's mandibles. That was when Amy Kowalski raised her hand. The silence that followed Amy's raised hand was the kind of quiet that preceded either enlightenment or catastrophic explosions. In a military academy, the smart money was always on explosion. Moran's scales cycled through several shades of purple before settling on a color that suggested he was processing information his brain refused to accept. His 6 arms performed a complex gesture that roughly translated to "What fresh hell is this?" in 17 different languages. Did the small human in the back just volunteer for academic suicide? Moran asked, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had witnessed too many tragedies to be surprised by one more. Amy stood up slowly, which required some effort since Krafthnog seating was designed for beings with entirely different joint configurations. "I would like to attempt the Earth simulation, instructor." The hall erupted in what could generously be called laughter, but sounded more like a zoo feeding time. Morton's chittering reached frequencies that made the windows vibrate. Judge Quintara's blade-like appendages clicked together in rhythmic amusement. Even Brandon Torres, despite his human solidarity obligations, couldn't suppress a snort. "Oh, this is rich," muttered Vashy, a serpentine whose species was known for their tactical brilliance and their complete inability to understand irony. The human wants to beat the human simulation. What's next? A Thraken? Trying to out-intimidate a Thraken? Moran raised all 6 arms for silence, a gesture so dramatic it would have made a theater director weep with joy. "Miss Kowalski, are you aware that beings far more qualified than yourself have attempted this simulation?" Admiral Vashy, commander of the Centauri fleet, lasted exactly 3 minutes and 14 seconds before declaring the entire scenario a violation of logical warfare principles. "What specifically caused Admiral Vashy to quit?" Amy asked, her voice carrying the kind of calm that suggested she was either very confident or very delusional. Moran's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. He was required to coordinate simultaneous amphibious invasions across multiple theaters, while managing resource allocation between competing commanders who actively disliked each other. The simulation expected him to make strategic decisions based on incomplete intelligence, while maintaining morale among troops who were fighting for abstract concepts like freedom and democracy, rather than tangible rewards. "That sounds like Tuesday," Amy replied. The hall fell silent again. This time the silence had a different quality, like the moment before a star goes supernova. "General Krafthnog," Moran continued, determined to educate this clearly delusional human, lasted 6 hours. He rage quit when the simulation required him to coordinate with allied forces whose military doctrines contradicted each other at a fundamental level. Apparently, some human commanders prioritized civilian casualties over tactical efficiency, while others made strategic decisions based on personal honor rather than mathematical probability. "Imagine that," Amy said dryly. Brandon Torres leaned over to whisper loudly enough for half the hall to hear. "Amy, maybe you should reconsider this. The simulation is designed to be impossible. For aliens," Amy corrected, settling back into her seat with the confidence of someone who had clearly lost her mind. Moran's theatrical presentation switched into high gear. The holographic displays lit up with complex tactical scenarios that looked like someone had tried to organize chaos into neat little boxes and failed spectacularly. "The Earth simulation begins in your year 1944. Moran announced, his voice taking on the ceremonial tone reserved for funeral services and final exams. "You will be required to manage the Allied forces across the European theater, the Pacific theater, and the North African campaigns. Simultaneously, your objectives include coordinating with Soviet forces who trust you about as much as a Regalian trusts a used hover car salesman. Managing American commanders who believe individual initiative is more important than chain of command, and working with British strategists who base half their decisions on maintaining imperial prestige. The holographic displays showed supply lines that looked like spaghetti thrown at a wall map, command structures that resembled a committee designed by a committee, and resource allocation charts that would make an accountant weep. Furthermore, Moran continued with the enthusiasm of someone describing root canal procedures. You must coordinate naval operations across multiple oceans, air campaigns that rely on technology that changes monthly, and ground forces using equipment that ranges from cutting edge to museum pieces, all while maintaining diplomatic relationships with allies who regularly threaten to quit the alliance if they don't get their way. Raklon raised a scaly appendage. Instructor, this sounds like a recipe for complete strategic breakdown. Exactly, Moran replied. Human military strategy operates on the principle that if you can't solve a problem logically, throw more problems at it until something breaks in your favor. It's madness disguised as methodology. The betting began immediately. Mortin offered 3-to-1 odds that Amy would quit within the first hour. Judge Quintera wagered she wouldn't last past the initial briefing phase. Even the usually supportive Brandon Torres quietly put down money on a 40-minute failure time. Quartermaster A. Moran called out, "Prepare the simulation chamber for another glorious failure." Quartermaster A., whose species resembled a fusion of an octopus and a filing cabinet, began activating the complex holographic systems with the resignation of someone who had watched this particular tragedy many times before. Simulation parameters loaded. Instructor. Earth scenario, year 1944, full complexity engaged, medical team standing by for inevitable mental breakdown. Amy walked toward the simulation chamber, ignoring the continued laughter and commentary from her fellow recruits. As she reached the entrance, Moran's voice stopped her. "Miss Kowalski, one final warning. This simulation has broken stronger minds than yours." Admiral Drahorn spent 3 weeks in psychological rehabilitation after attempting it. "Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed?" Amy turned back with a smile that would have made a predator nervous. "Instructor Moran, with respect, you've just described every Tuesday in human history. I think I can manage." The chamber door sealed behind her with a sound like destiny closing. The holographic command center materialized around Amy with the subtle elegance of a tactical nightmare. Multiple screens displayed real-time data from theaters of war that spanned half a planet, while communication arrays crackled with voices, speaking in accents that ranged from British understatement to American enthusiasm to Soviet determination. Outside the simulation chamber, Moran settled into his observation chair with the satisfaction of someone about to witness a predictable disaster. The viewing screens showed Amy standing in the center of the holographic chaos, surrounded by more information than most beings could process in a standard day cycle. "Current betting pool stands at 47 minutes, Quartermaster AA announced helpfully. Though Cadet Zephyrin from the Advanced Tactics course has optimistically wagered she might last a full hour." "Generous of him," Moran replied, his scales settling into a comfortable shade of anticipatory purple. Admiral Vashy was considered a strategic genius, and he quit before the first supply report finished loading. The first test came immediately. The simulation presented Amy with conflicting intelligence reports from 3 different sources about German troop movements in France, each report contradicting the others in fundamental ways. Standard protocol demanded waiting for verification, cross-referencing the data, and forming a tactical committee to evaluate options. Amy glanced at the reports for about 30 seconds, then promptly ignored 2 of them and acted on the third. "What is she doing?" Mortin chittered, his compound eyes reflecting confusion. "She cannot possibly have analyzed all the available data in that time frame. She is going to fail spectacularly," Judge Quintara observed with the clinical detachment of someone watching a slow-motion disaster. "Look, she is committing resources based on incomplete intelligence." But then something unexpected happened. Amy's decision worked. The German positions she had targeted based on the single intelligence report, turned out to be exactly where her attack forces found them. The operation succeeded ahead of schedule and under budget, which in military terms was like finding a unicorn that balanced your books. Moran's scales shifted to a lighter purple. Coincidence, he muttered. She simply got lucky with random chance. The second test arrived in the form of a supply chain crisis that would have given a logistics professor nightmares. Resources needed to be allocated between the European theatre, where British forces were demanding more anti-aircraft guns, the Pacific theatre, where American forces needed amphibious landing craft, and the Soviet front, where winter equipment was desperately required. Standard military doctrine called for careful analysis of strategic priorities, mathematical modeling of resource allocation efficiency, and consultation with Allied command structures to determine optimal distribution patterns. Amy took one look at the situation and started making decisions based on what appeared to be pure instinct. She sent the anti-aircraft guns to Britain, not because the mathematical models indicated it was the optimal choice, but because she seemed to understand that British morale was more important than raw tactical efficiency. She redirected half the landing craft to the Soviets instead of the Pacific, apparently because she realized that keeping the Eastern Front active was worth delaying Pacific operations by 3 weeks. This makes no sense, Vracklin hissed, his serpentine form coiling with agitation. She is prioritizing emotional factors over tactical mathematics. And it is working, Quartermaster A added, unnecessarily, because sometimes stating the obvious was the only way to process the impossible. By the 30-minute mark, Amy had successfully coordinated 3 simultaneous operations across different continents, managed supply lines that defied logical organization, and somehow convinced a Soviet general and an American admiral to work together, despite the fact that they communicated through interpreters and mutual suspicion. Moran's scales were now cycling through colors that suggested his worldview was undergoing rapid deconstruction. Someone call Instructor Thakmore from Advanced Strategic Studies. He needs to see this. The real breakthrough came when Amy encountered the simulation's infamous diplomatic crisis protocol. Allied commanders were threatening to withdraw from joint operations because of disagreements over post-war territorial arrangements, resource allocation, and fundamental differences in military philosophy. Every previous attempt at the simulation had founded on this exact scenario. The logical approach was to find compromises that satisfied all parties, create formal agreements that addressed each concern, and establish clear command hierarchies that minimized conflict. Amy ignored all of that. Instead, she started what could only be described as psychological warfare against her own allies. She convinced the British that supporting American operations would enhance their post-war influence. She persuaded the Americans that deferring to Soviet priorities in Eastern Europe would guarantee their dominance in the Pacific. She managed to make the Soviets believe that cooperation with Western allies was their idea in the first place. She is manipulating them, Judge Quintara observed, her blade-like appendages clicking with what might have been admiration or horror. She is using their emotional weaknesses against. That is not tactics, Mortin protested. That is human, Brandon Torres said quietly, and for the first time since the simulation began, he was not laughing. Instructor Thakmore arrived just as Amy was coordinating a joint operation that required American naval forces, British air support, and Soviet ground troops to work together in a synchronized assault that previous simulations had declared mathematically impossible. Explain to me what I am observing, Thakmore demanded, his Hegelian features expressing the kind of confusion usually reserved for philosophical paradoxes. The human is succeeding where 847 other beings have failed, Moran replied, his voice carrying the tone of someone whose fundamental understanding of reality was being surgically removed without anesthesia. On the screens, Amy was simultaneously managing D-Day preparations, Pacific island hopping campaigns, and Eastern Front winter operations. She coordinated air support, naval bombardments, and ground assaults across multiple time zones, while maintaining diplomatic relationships that should have collapsed under their own contradictions. The hour mark passed. Then 90 minutes. The betting pool evolved into a mixture of fascination and existential dread. How is she processing this much information? Krafthnog asked, watching Amy make decisions that violated every principle of logical command structure, while somehow producing optimal results. She is not processing it, Moran realized with growing horror. She is feeling it. She is making decisions based on intuition and emotional understanding, rather than mathematical analysis. That should not work, Quartermaster A protested. And yet, Moran replied, watching Amy successfully coordinate operations that spanned continents and involved millions of simulated personnel. Here we are. By the 2-hour mark, other instructors were arriving to witness what was being whispered about as either the greatest simulation success in Academy history, or evidence that the Earth simulation was fundamentally broken. Amy continued working with the calm efficiency of someone who had found her natural element, while outside the chamber, the greatest military minds in the galaxy tried to understand how human illogic was somehow more effective than alien logic. The mounting tension in the observation room was thick enough to require environmental controls. 3 hours into what should have been a 30-minute failure, Amy was simultaneously orchestrating the liberation of Paris, coordinating island-hopping campaigns across the Pacific, and managing a supply crisis that involved shipping winter equipment to Stalingrad, while maintaining secrecy about Allied invasion plans. The alien observers had progressed through the traditional stages of disbelief, denial, anger, bargaining, and were now approaching what appeared to be a collective nervous breakdown. This cannot be happening, Moran muttered, his scales cycling through colors that did not exist in standard Thraken emotional spectrums. She is currently managing 17 different operational theaters, while conducting diplomatic negotiations with 4 allied governments who fundamentally disagree about everything except their mutual desire to win. Amy had just finished convincing Churchill that supporting American Pacific operations would enhance British post-war influence, while simultaneously persuading Roosevelt that British Mediterranean strategies aligned with American interests, all while making Stalin believe that Western cooperation was essential for Soviet security. She accomplished this through a combination of selective information sharing, emotional manipulation, and what could only be described as strategic lying. She is deceiving them, Judge Quintara observed with horror. She is providing each ally with different versions of the same operational plan, tailored to their specific psychological vulnerabilities. That is not military strategy, Krafthnog protested, his serpentine form tied in knots that suggested deep philosophical distress. That is confidence fraud on a planetary scale, and it is working, Quartermaster, A added with the tone of someone announcing the heat death of the universe. The simulation, apparently designed by beings who believed in fair play and logical progression, began escalating its difficulty in increasingly desperate attempts to break Amy's performance. Supply crises multiplied. Diplomatic incidents erupted. Technical failures cascaded across multiple systems. Amy responded by improvising solutions that violated every principle of military doctrine while somehow producing optimal results. When the Pacific Fleet faced fuel shortages that should have grounded operations for weeks, Amy redistributed resources by convincing different commanders that their individual sacrifices were actually strategic advantages. When European operations faced equipment failures, she improvised repairs using materials that were technically incompatible, but functionally unlikely. When diplomatic relations threatened to collapse over post-war territory arrangements, she managed to make each ally believe they were getting exactly what they wanted while giving them completely different things. "Someone call Commander Tom Melly," Instructor Krafthnog demanded, his Hegelian features expressing the kind of panic usually reserved for imminent planetary destruction. Either the simulation is malfunctioning, or we are witnessing something that fundamentally challenges our understanding of military science. Moran's sarcastic commentary, which had sustained him through decades of watching recruits fail in predictable ways, had degraded into nervous muttering. She cannot possibly be coordinating operations across this many variables. The cognitive load alone should have caused neural shutdown 40 minutes ago. But Amy continued operating with the calm efficiency of someone who found chaos naturally comfortable. She was currently managing D-Day logistics while coordinating Pacific carrier operations and negotiating with Soviet commanders about Eastern Front priorities. Her approach involved making decisions based on intuition, emotional understanding, and strategic deception, rather than mathematical analysis or logical frameworks. Commander Tom Marley arrived with the urgency of someone investigating a potential reality breakdown. His Centaurian heritage gave him natural analytical abilities that bordered on computational, which made his current expression of complete bewilderment particularly unsettling. "Explain the situation," Marley demanded, his four eyes focusing on different screens simultaneously. "The human has been successfully operating the Earth simulation for 3 hours and 47 minutes. Moran reported with the tone of someone confessing to crimes against nature. "She has coordinated multi-theater operations, managed complex alliance structures, and resolved supply chain crises using methods that should not work according to any rational analysis." Marley studied the displays showing Amy's performance metrics. These numbers indicate she is operating at efficiency levels that exceed theoretical maximums for multi-variable strategic coordination. "That is because she is not using strategic coordination," Thakmore explained desperately. "She is using emotional manipulation, strategic deception, and improvised solutions based on psychological understanding rather than tactical analysis." The simulation reached its climactic phase as Amy encountered the scenario that had broken every previous attempt, the nuclear decision matrix. She was required to coordinate the development, deployment, and strategic implications of weapons that could end the war immediately, but carried consequences that extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations. Standard military doctrine demanded careful analysis of long-term strategic implications, consultation with allied governments, and mathematical modeling of probable outcomes. The decision required balancing immediate tactical advantages against future diplomatic relationships, moral considerations, and post-war power structures. Amy took one look at the situation and made her decision based on factors that appeared to be completely intuitive. She authorized the nuclear program, but simultaneously began negotiations for post-war nuclear treaties. She coordinated the tactical deployment while establishing diplomatic frameworks for preventing future nuclear conflicts. She managed to make the decision appear inevitable to American commanders, necessary to British strategists, and acceptable to Soviet leadership, all while maintaining secrecy from enemy forces. "She is thinking in temporal dimensions that extend beyond the immediate conflict," Marley observed with growing amazement. "She is making strategic decisions based on consequences that will not manifest for decades." The observation room was now packed with instructors from every department in the academy. Word had spread through the facility that something unprecedented was occurring in Simulation Chamber 7. Beings who had studied military strategy for centuries watched a human accomplish what their combined expertise had declared impossible. "How is she processing information from this many sources simultaneously?" demanded Professor Keftel from the Strategic Intelligence Department. "She is not processing it," Moran replied with the tone of someone whose worldview had been thoroughly demolished. "She is intuiting it. She is making decisions based on emotional understanding of human psychology, rather than logical analysis of strategic variables." By the 4-hour mark, Amy was successfully coordinating the final phases of a global conflict while simultaneously establishing frameworks for post-war reconstruction, international cooperation, and nuclear deterrence. She had managed to achieve victory conditions while maintaining alliance structures that should have collapsed under their own contradictions. The crowd of alien observers watched in silence as Amy continued operations that violated every principle they had been taught about logical warfare, while producing results that exceeded optimal projections. "This is impossible," Marley announced with the authority of someone stating a fundamental law of physics. "And yet," Moran replied, watching Amy coordinate victory celebrations across multiple continents while planning peace negotiations, "here we are." The simulation chamber filled with golden light as the holographic displays showed a simple message that had never appeared in the Earth simulation's 200-year history. Victory achieved. All objectives completed. Simulation terminated successfully. The observation room fell silent with the kind of quiet that suggested reality had just filed a formal complaint against the universe. Amy emerged from the chamber looking slightly tired but otherwise unaffected, as if she had just completed a routine training exercise rather than accomplished the impossible. She brushed a strand of hair from her face and noticed the crowd of alien instructors staring at her, with expressions that ranged from shock to existential terror. "How was that?" she asked cheerfully. The question triggered what could only be described as a collective alien nervous breakdown. Moran's scales were cycling through colors that did not exist in any known emotional spectrum. His 6 arms gestured wildly as he struggled to form words. You cannot, the simulation 847 failures 200 years impossible. Actually, Amy replied with the patience of someone explaining simple concepts to confused children. It was fairly straightforward once you understand how humans approach warfare. Commander Marley stepped forward, his 4 eyes focusing on Amy with the intensity of someone trying to solve a fundamental equation of existence. "Miss Kowalski, you must explain your methodology. Your success rate exceeded all theoretical parameters for multivariable strategic coordination." Amy considered this for a moment. "Well, the thing is, you are all approaching human military strategy like it is supposed to make sense. But humans do not fight wars with logic. We fight them with emotions, adaptation, and really good improvisation skills." "That should not work," Professor Krafthnog protested weakly. "But it does," Amy replied. "See, logical beings try to solve military problems by analyzing all variables and calculating optimal solutions. Humans just throw solutions at problems until something works, then we pretend we planned it that way all along." Judge Quintera's blade-like appendages clicked nervously. "But the resource allocation, the diplomatic negotiations, the strategic deception—" "Oh, that," Amy waved dismissively. "Humans have been lying to each other for tactical advantage since we figured out how to make pointy sticks. We call it diplomacy when we do it between governments, and psychology when we do it to our own troops." The crowd of alien observers exchanged glances that suggested their fundamental understanding of warfare was undergoing rapid deconstruction. "You mean?" Instructor Thakmore said slowly. "Human military doctrine is based on emotional manipulation and adaptive improvisation rather than logical strategic frameworks." "Pretty much," Amy confirmed. "We also throw in generous amounts of stubbornness, spite and refusing to quit when any rational being would surrender. It is not elegant, but it works." Moran finally managed to form complete sentences, though his voice carried the tone of someone whose worldview had been professionally demolished. "Miss Kowalski, you have just completed a simulation that has defeated the greatest military minds in galactic history. How do you explain your success?" Amy shrugged. "I am human. The simulation was based on human warfare. It would be like asking a fish to explain how it swims. I do not think about it, I just do it." The aftermath was swift and catastrophic for the Academy's sense of self-importance. Within hours, Amy had become an unwilling celebrity as news of her achievement spread throughout the facility. Recruits from advanced classes lined up to ask her about human military strategy. Instructors requested formal lectures on emotional warfare techniques. The Academy's Strategic Studies Department went into emergency session to determine whether their entire curriculum needed revision. The simulation itself underwent immediate modifications. Quartermaster A spent 3 days installing what he called human-proofing protocols, which essentially meant adding warning labels that read, "Simulation not designed for humans and logical beings only." The betting pool results created their own crisis, as Morting realized he owed more credits than existed in his family's generational savings account. But the most significant change was in Moran himself. 3 weeks later, as he stood before a new class of recruits, his scales had settled into a permanent shade of bewildered purple. His famous confidence had been replaced by the cautious humility of someone who had learned that the universe contained possibilities he had never considered. "Today we begin planetary military simulations," he announced to the fresh batch of evolutionary mistakes. "Before we start, I must warn you that everything I thought I knew about warfare has been proven fundamentally incorrect by a human who weighs less than my left arm." He paused, his mandibles clicking thoughtfully. "It turns out that logic, strategy, and rational analysis are merely suggestions when it comes to military operations. The universe, it seems, has a sense of humor, and that sense of humor appears to be human. In the back of the hall, Amy Kowalski sat quietly taking notes, already dreading the moment when someone would ask her to attempt the Rigelian Ice Wars simulation. Some victories, she reflected, created more problems than they solved. But that, as Moran was slowly learning, was a very human way to think about success.